Welcome to Power Talk. I'm Kamal Franklin. To my left is Andre Moore, and sitting in for Neil Nelson. And our host today will be Tracy Donnelly.
Hi, everyone. Today we're going to jump into the Philando Castile verdict that was given on Friday. If you guys, or you guys are probably familiar, last year, ex-officer Geronimo Yanis pulled over Philando Castile for a broken taillight. Castile alerted him that he was carrying, and within seconds, he was shot. His girlfriend Diamond recorded the incident, and on Facebook Live, people were shocked to see the outcome of a man who was basically dying in the car with his girlfriend and the child of his girlfriend. On Friday, the jury said that they acquitted him on all charges. And it turns out that even though it took 5 days for the verdict to be released, in fact, most of them, 10 of the 12 jurors, were certain that they were going to acquit him from Monday, which is 4 days prior. It was really only two additional jurors that were holding out, but they gave in essentially on Friday. This verdict is yet another in so many cases where officers, both black and white, have been killing unarmed, sometimes armed black men and black women and essentially getting away with it. So from both of you guys, I want to get an idea of how should black people interpret this verdict and what does it truly mean for their safety in America?
I think this verdict still, for us as a people, indicates that nothing has really changed in terms of police relationships with the community. Here you have, as you described, a young man who's told the police that he was carrying,
Right,
that followed every instruction that the police gave,
right.
and still he wound up dead. So whether or not he had his Second Amendment rights, whether or not he was unarmed, whether or not he was running, whether or not he was standing still, the lives of black people still mean little in this country to nothing. And unfortunately, although I think there's been a great amount of movement in terms of organizing over the last few years on this kind of stuff, we still come back to these situations where there is no justice when we go into these courtrooms, and we don't have prosecutors who really fight our cause, and we don't have judges who really help to make sure that these cases come out in a way that vindicates our folks who are being shot down illegally.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think that this is just another example that the justice system was not intended to bring justice for the black community. I think also that the methods that black people have been using to petition the system to make changes to improve the way that police relate to black folks also, as you said, very little changes, and that we need to probably reassess how we approach what solutions we come up with to make changes, and what we've been doing so far has not been working.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about that because Castile's mom, she had a very passionate press conference after the verdict was announced. And in her words, she said the system continues to fail black people. In one way, it appeared that she was shocked that the verdict was for the officer to be acquitted, because in some ways she hoped for it to, because the case seemed so clear in her mind and in so many others' mind that obviously there was culpable negligence in what the officer did, putting his girlfriend at risk, putting his child at risk. There was no appearance of a gun. He wasn't unsure if he was going for the gun. But for her, it seemed that she just arrived at the place where she now realized that somehow the system is failing black people. And so to your point, Dre, what does a system overhaul look like? Because for some, they would say that the system is working the way that it's supposed to be working. So what do we do to have a whole new system that works in our favor?
Yeah, I think the system, the people are right. The system is working how it's supposed to work. I don't think that the intention is to bring justice. I think police are primarily armed agents for the status quo, and they are doing their job. That is to protect property primarily, and as well as the business that has been put all around the criminal industrial complex of pushing black bodies into prison and all the money and the industry that's created around that. they're enforcers of that, and so that's how it's designed to work. However, in the way that as you were saying, what an overhaul would look like is what we've always been talking about here, is that people have to feel that it's not in their interest to take advantage of your community that way. And without the power to do so, then you will always be victimized by any kind of system that is created that has intentions to benefit someone at the expense of another person or other people.
I mean, I'll add on. Obviously, short of a revolutionary upswing in activity, we're going to have to deal with the police in our community in some way, somehow. And I do think, in terms of some of the activism, I think people have pleaded for good short-term relief, as in cameras, bias training, more black folks on the force. But these things, even cobbled together, are not a real solution, as you were saying, because of how the police are not only trained, but, like as you said, as to how the institution works when it comes to our community. I think the only idea to me, as long as we're part of this larger society, is that we have to demilitarize the police. We have to bring change systemically in terms of who gets to control the police. And something that I've called for and other organizers have called for decades has been community control of the police, which means creating boards which control the local precincts that have the power to hire, fire, and discipline police. And so, one, it'll make all those police who have these racist thoughts scatter, because as soon as they know that instead of a commander who reports to a head of an agency somewhere outside of the community no longer has power, they no longer want to be part of a police force that's really operating in the name of the community. So I think getting folks in the community to be a part of a board, we have school boards, we have other things that help with us in terms of how we work things in our community. There's no reason why the police can't operate in that mode. Decentralize the police, have communities control who gets to be hired to come into the community, and what happens in terms of who gets to be fired, and how that interaction happens.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how effective community control would be, or if there could ever be true community control. I think today they have versions of that. I think that they've used to pacify people, community oversight committees that they have that look at police behavior, and they're often not given teeth. Just an opinion that doesn't really move the needle one way or the other. So I don't know how feasible do you think, or likely it is, that a community oversight, community control can, one, take place, and secondly, if it's instituted, would it be effective in curtailing police violence in the community?
No, I think really quickly the difference between civilian complaint review boards, which are still outside agencies that have these professional heads who decide what happens. They're still linked to police departments in terms of how the punishments are either enacted or dished out. That's not what I'm talking about in terms of a larger solution. I'm talking about people in the community actually having the control to hire, fire, and to punish police when they act badly or wrongly in our community. Again, I think there are other ideas that people have come up with which are basically getting rid of the police.
Yes,
Now, I'm not.
that's what I was going
You're
to
going
say
to bring,
next.
yeah.
Well, is abolishing the police too radical of an idea, and can it really work?
To me, I mean, I grew up in the projects, and as much as my mom may have shouted out against the police, she also wanted what she thought was protection, right? And I think, again, these are longer term ideas and solutions, but as we work towards moving our community towards something that we think is a real community that we control, that we have assets in, that we treat each other in different lights, then I think we can think about what abolishing the police may look like. But in large industrial, post-industrial societies, culturally connected communities don't really exist as they have in the past. And I think one way to get to a place where we have less police violence is basically to say to these police that you no longer have just a sergeant, and then that sergeant has a lieutenant and so forth, and who you have to answer to. These people in the community who you police every day now have the say in how policing is done. I think that's the only method under our current structures that could work, because I think it will chase out all those police officers who don't want to. if they don't feel like policing the black community in a respectable way, they certainly don't believe in being policed by the community in a certain way. So they're going to leave. And I think that'll give us the opportunity to bring in new people, bring in different types of trainings and tactics that maybe can do better for our community, including lessening the need for guns in terms of what the police have in our community. I think there should only be special units who carry guns. Why is every cop, every 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old who finishes the police academy allowed to have a gun in our community and allowed just to shoot?
Right.
Right. But I think that that's part of a broader kind of police kind of criminal justice that America wants to see. The tough cop that is hard hard on crime. I think both police feel empowered and with guns, and would as many people sign up for the job if they didn't have guns. So I think that those are concerns that that they would have, and that would also be the difficulties in which to change that system that we currently have of armed police officers. But I do agree that why are they so militant on every call? Like, why are guns brandished? Why were they even given tasers? And what's the criteria for when to use a taser or as well to use a firearm?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that calls for day-to-day action on the community. So it can't be reactionary that every time someone gets shot by the police, then we get angry and we protest, and then it dies out. We wait for them to be indicted. We wait for the verdict, and we protest. It's almost as though there's a cycle of which we express our anger, but there's not a day-to-day planning. If your plan was to go into action, that takes a day-to-day work. And oftentimes, we're only reacting based on the major event, where Castile's mom is literally saying that her son loved the city. He had a tattoo of Twin Cities. So how could you? How could the city have murdered her son? Did she not see Terrence Crutcher? Did she not see Tamir Rice? The countless, Eric Gardner. I mean, there are so many examples that it doesn't have to happen in your city. It doesn't have to happen to your child. God forbid. But there's instances that should mobilize us to say that the police forces in America and what they're planning within the criminal justice system is impacting all of us, right? So I want to go back really quickly to what Yanis said during his testimony. He said, "I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die. My family's faces popped up in my mind, my wife and my baby." It's almost like a script, right?
Yes.
So all they have to say is that I feared for my life. And he was even choking up when he said that. So in some ways, there could be a genuine fear that he had. So what do you think fuels that fear amongst officers for black men and for black women, even for black boys, who I think a study found that boys as young as 12 is perceived as adults by cops?
I think we have a culturally racist society, right? And whites in particular are born to think about black people in a certain way. Whether or not they get that history directly in school anymore, they certainly get it in terms of their houses, amongst their friends, amongst their parents,
The media.
the media,
Particularly, yeah.
So I think those images of what they come, and whether or not they're white or Latino and or sometimes black, they come into these professions with a profound distrust of black people and what our intents are, particularly in certain communities, and they act those out. And I think you're right. I think part of the strategy in terms of the defense is basically to have the jury believe exactly that he feared for his life, which again in this case it worked because it says now voluntary manslaughter no longer applies. But this case is the very definition of what involuntary manslaughter was. This is somebody. It wasn't about malice or having a certain intent. It was about he put out directions to this young man. This young man followed those directions, and still he decided to kill him.
Yeah, I think that the whole way that script is used, I feared for my life, shows a kind of deliberateness within the criminal justice system. I think that these officers, it seems as if they're coached, well instructed on, that's the go-to term whenever you've shot a person who was unarmed and non-threatening. And you have to create that they were a threat. But I think that, as you were saying, that the indoctrination of being the threat. I don't think it's just necessarily fear. I think it's also contempt. I think that blacks, through serious, long-term propaganda, are seen as the bane of society, the scapegoat for what's wrong with inner cities and things of that nature, and as well as the fear that they're dangerous. And so, therefore, I think that the attitudes, and you can hear in some of many of the cases where the police officers were overheard on dash cam footage, when they're talking about their attitudes towards the person, there's that whole contempt and the whole like, yeah, I'm tough on crime. I'm the cowboy. I'm coming in shooting and letting these criminals know who's boss. And I think that is the attitude that they carry. They're ready to shoot before they're even on the scene assessing what the circumstances are.
Definitely. So black people are a minority in this country. And if we look at studies, there are studies after studies that it's sort of like a sad story after another sad story. It almost appears that there is no way out for black people to kind of live freely, black boy joy, black girl magic, kind of be themselves and not fear for their lives. You're not fearing for your child when they step out. Are there other examples of other groups that have been a minority that has created a space for themselves where they feel secure in their community?
Well, I think you have other groups of whites when they first came to this country who were treated as outsiders, the Irish, the Italians, Jewish folks. And for the Irish and the Italians, I mean, the Irish folks in particular basically took over the police and they started joining in mass numbers. But for those two particular communities, once they were adopted as white, it didn't matter. I think for Jewish folks who practiced the religion of Judaism, those folks are a better example in terms of they kept cohesive communities, at least in certain parts of the country, and then started to acquire power within those communities, even if their numbers were a minority within. I grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which is overwhelmingly black, but there was a certain time period where the Jewish Hasidic community controlled the city council seat. They controlled the local school board. They controlled various offices. They controlled how the money that came in from the city was applied and who got the most of that money through organizations they created. So there was a systematic and systemic attempt, an organized attempt, to make sure that their community was not harmed. They created ambulance services and other things, teaching, school facilities, and everything else to try to protect their community from outside harm. So I think there are examples that we could use if we changed our mindset about how we should approach our relationship to this larger society.
So how do those examples differ from places like Atlanta or Detroit, where black folks are kind of have political control? They're majority of the police force. They control city council and other places and other institutions or other positions within government. Yet the same things still happen within the community. What do you think is a difference?
I think I think the economic basis is really the big difference. The political factions that got in claiming to represent blackness or represent black people still were beholden, i.e. South Africa, on white moneyed support, on economic interests like developers and other folks who didn't ever leave the city but knew they were outnumbered statistically. And so they were willing to strike bargains on who gets to have electoral control as opposed to who gets to have moneyed control.
Right.
And so creating some small black middle class came out of it, particularly here in Atlanta. But as we can see now, it didn't alter sort of the fundamental structures of who controls the sort of economic levers. And on a larger scale, you still have the state that comes in because we're a minority within the state who also tamps down on city politics or city directions from mayors when they think those mayors may go too far in terms of black rights or that kind of thing. In Detroit, for instance, really quickly, there was a time period where they had a black mayor and they started appointing really radical, let's say, black judges who cared about the community. The state stepped in and started figuring out ways to change how voting took place or who got to appoint judges at a city level, county level, so that these black judges would no longer get appointed. And so there's different maneuvers that are taken. But at a basic level, we still have to get organized to even counter those kind of moves.
Right.
So what do you think, Dre, is the difference?
No, I agree with Kamal that that the difference is economic power, and that was leading me to a statement I was saying is that another thing about how I think because there's been protests since the verdict, and there was protests after the shooting, and I think that there's all these protests. I think interestingly they're multiracial
Mm-hmm.
protests, and the system, it seems almost as if the system has built a buffer around the protest, like yeah, you can protest this and that but nothing changes. And so I guess the difference is what kind of teeth are you building around your countermeasures to these kind of activities. So whereas we're just protesting, but economic power, as Kamal mentioned, I think is the key to it. I think that you have to be able to elect people who are in these positions, judges, DAs, assistant DAs, and even police commissioners, things like that. But they have to be beholden to the black community, the community which
Right.
they serve.
Right. Is that a role that a movement that like Black Lives Matter can take on? Is that because they have amassed so much? They have amassed wealth with some
Mm-hmm.
donations, but also their numbers and their reach, and their impact is global now. So now that they have established this, can they use the power that they have gained over the last few years? I think since Trayvon Martin's death,
Hmm.
to be able to be that force to make those changes.
I think with the right leadership, they can always pivot. But I think currently, as it stands, they're not necessarily interested in those kind of power moves. I think that they're primarily interested, as I was saying before, with protesting the status quo, disrupting, bringing attention to the issue, but not necessarily have an agenda or a concrete agenda on how to actually change things. Using power, punishing people, rewarding people based on how they comply with the interest of the community.
And I'm not sure, to be honest.
Hmm.
I don't know enough about sort of the inner workings of Black Lives Matter. I know some people who are part of it, of course, like everybody does.
Hmm.
But I do think there's that push pull, as you mentioned, is the equity reform mode, and there's the how do we gain power mode. And
Hmm.
I think they probably even have inner conflict around how do we move forward. And I think part of what's happened is I think even if I'm correct, they've de-escalated some of the tactics of mass protests because they're trying to figure out like are there other steps now that we need to be taken. How far are these protests? And I'm in support of protests, to be honest. I think that's one lever that people who have not figured out other ways in which to gain power
Hmm.
have in terms of protesting, having abuses
Should they
upon us.
protest more? Maybe protest every day, so at least it's a true disruption,
Sure,
as
yeah.
Yeah,
opposed to
I think
I'm not
protests
a
are
fan
part
of
of.
protesting. I'm not saying that it cannot be used, so I'm not saying can take it completely off the table. But I think that is the very lowest level of discontent that you can show. I think that I think as a community we spend too much time protesting. A lot of
Mhm.
that time could be spent figuring out how we organize in ways that could be effective in making changes, and other people are doing it. So it's not like rocket science. I think that as a group collectively we have to come together and decide that that's what we're going to do, organize. um but I think that we're still encouraged by previous rhetoric, propaganda, whatever we want to call it, that encourages us that the right way to go about is civic disobedience.
Mhm.
And I think that we're the only group that buys into that in large. Whereas other people, even if they use civic disobedience to some extent, they have so many other levers being pulled, in terms of their cause. And I think that right now, that's mostly what we have is just civic
Yeah.
disobedience.
Well, I think that folks use civil disobedience as a way, as you said, like if you do it in a way in which you are listening to the authorities when they tell you to come protest, where you can protest,
Hmm.
where you should go, how long you can stay, what your tactics should be, then I agree it's a losing battle because they're set up to contain that type of protest.
Hmm.
But as you said, in other societies, in other places, sometimes even here, people will use protests outside the boundaries of what they are subscribed to by the larger powers.
Hmm.
I thought it was powerful when Trump came into office and he tried to enact his ban on Muslims, basically, people actually went to the airport. I think that was an extremely powerful move and decision that may have been centralized, may have been decentralized, but to put yourself in a position to shut down air travel in a country is something that really shakes the levers of power. And I think actually do think that's one reason why you had a judge quickly make a decision to postpone enacting this particular ban. So I do think that, you don't think
Yeah,
so?
I think
that's,
so. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Different
I'll let
people's
you.
oppression are perceived differently by other groups, right? So black people have been going through this for decades. I mean, for centuries, right? And you don't have businesses who are pulling out of the NAACP tournament because they're enacting a bathroom law. You don't have the major corporations that are standing up and saying we won't do business with you until you change this. Verdict after verdict, they're just silent. There are some who now kind of stand up and say that we stand with Black lives, but what moves this country is money, and they're not speaking with their money as it relates to Black oppression.
There's no opposition to your statement. I think that's completely true. And I think that's part of the larger, I mean, it may not be rocket science, but it certainly ain't easy, right? And I don't think we should pretend that it's easy. There are difficult decisions, there are difficult judgments, there are difficult ways in which we have to make economic, political power work for us that we have not figured out. And some of it is because we're prevented from doing it, or other people make, as you were saying, counter moves that stop us from doing it. But I think you're certainly right. Like we are considered a dangerous, controversial people. And for large corporations, unless it's overtly obvious that this racism was something that they cannot even sort of stand for or take because it's going to give them a bad public image, they're not going to step out and support us.
Yeah.
And nor should we ask them to.
Yeah.
Actually, to be
For
honest
one,
with
I
you.
think that identifying the airport incident kind of it doesn't necessarily accurately shows that, because there's so much power that was on the opposite of the end of Trump's travel ban. So I don't think that was a grassroots community thing that caused judges to be like, I think that that's to the highest level of government in terms of opposing that
Oh,
viewpoint.
no, I disagree. I mean, it was announced, and there were immediate protests from various places. I don't think it was completely grassroots. There's institutions like the ACLU and other institutions on the ground that may have said put out a call. But I think the fact that people responded and did something like that, as opposed to we're going to organize a march from downtown to the head of the police department from 4 to 8. We're going to get a permit to do so. We're going to have speakers, and then after 8 o'clock, we're going to leave. Right? I think that's the dynamic I'm suggesting that we should fall off of, stop using. I think if we're going to use protests, and I think we should as part of a larger strategy, we have to do it in a way that affects the way the society works, the mechanisms in which people use power and try to get away with doing things and think they can still keep the society operating because they hem you into this small box, and that's where they want you to operate. And yeah, go voice your anger. It's going to be, get it off your chest and go back home.
Right. So are you saying that when these people protest, that protests in general throughout American history do you think what has moved the needle in
I
terms
think at
of
times, of course. I think there's obvious examples that protests at times have been part of the solution to problems that people face. Again, not only here but around the world.
But the two minority group examples that you use, I don't recall them using protests as their medium to gain power.
Well, they weren't black, so one, and and part of this might be that some groups did use some protests, and I just am not familiar with but there have been economic protests. There's the Shays Rebellion. There's different ways in which people have protests, and I'm going to use that within a large bandwidth of peaceful protests to more violent protests. In Cuba, part of the Cuban Revolution folk laws that Castro came down from the mountains and the military operation just sort of melted before him. But there was massive protests going on in the cities that were major strikes that stopped the operation of government as usual. And I think those are the type of protests that at some point we would have to employ to make serious changes.
Right. But I think like when you look at certain groups who are a lot smaller in numbers than black folks, such as the Asian community, that they're able to um, move government in their interest primarily through economic means. And I think that if you want to say that if you that
But
it
if
shows
Asians face the discrimination that black people have faced here, it's not.
not
How is it the same thing?
yeah, I'm
How
not
are you
saying
going to
I'm
put
not
them
saying the
in the same
same, but
pot as
I
us?
think that they were also classified as second class, third
Okay.
class citizens,
Hmm.
and I'm not sure yet if they're considered complementary whites either. So I don't know, or honorary whites,
Honorary rights.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't know if so I think that why they might not receive the same kind of contempt and visceral hate that black people have experienced in this country. I do think that other groups are a little bit more intelligent about how they address things that are outside of their interests, and I think that making a lot of noise in the streets is as again is seen as the least effective means of doing that.
So we're going to go back to
Hmm.
the Castile case. So in closing, unfortunately, Castile's mother will move on. His family, his friends will move on. There's another shooting that happened just over the weekend with a young woman. I think her name was Charlena Elias. She was a mother who was pregnant. I believe she had 4 kids, and they witnessed her being shot by 2 police officers who responded to a call that she made to the police for a burglary that was happening at her home. Unfortunately, that too will go through the same cycle. There'll be a protest, there'll be anger. The 2 officers may be indicted, they may not be.
Hmm.
We've gone through this. We've gone through slavery, we've gone through lynchings, we've gone through white mob violence, we've gone through Jim Crow. And there's no record of them being held accountable in mass. So resilience has been a thing that we kind of prop up as um, a great trait
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
we possess as black folks. You know, like we're resilient. We make it through. Other races would not be able to survive the way that we have. But honestly, in some ways, I feel as though we're on a slow, painful journey to extinction. So when will we have our wake up call?
Yeah, probably when it's too late, unless people who are organized. I don't think everyone has to be awoke, as they say, for these things to happen. I think most people just go along with our bandwagon jumpers. They go along with, they work in their interest, what they perceive as their interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to create the institutions that are able to leverage what people feel like their needs and their desires are to have them work in the interest of black folks. Um, that's what I think is where we need to go, the direction we need to go. I think that, as I said before, the protest talk and those things are too much attention goes to that. And if a group, if our groups or leadership are not talking about economic power moves, better organized and building institutions, then I think that that's unfit leadership for black people.
Mm.
I basically agree. I think that, although I would add protest into the mix, like you guys would, I think it has its place. But I agree that the need for power, as expressed through controlling institutions, and basically being able to push back those institutions that we don't control from being in our communities. But I think that comes with people depressing their egos, people working closer together, people not being brought out, and I think those things are easier said than done to stop and prevent those things from happening. But I think until we start to build a model that we begin to trust and see that it can make a difference in some part of our community, in some place within this country, unfortunately, we're going to use the tactics that we feel we've used. And even if they don't work, I think unfortunately people use them as a fallback position.
Hmm. Thank you, guys. Do you have any additional final words?
My final words is always, a quote Marcus Garvey: "If we're unwilling to do what other people have done, then we will die." And the thing about that is that, as I was saying, it's not easy. But other people have come up with solutions with how they've fought against oppression, and they've been more successful at it. So I think that the more intelligent thing to do is look why this group is more successful than how we've been and you know, as people who have relied primarily on civic disobedience.
I think there's other tactics we can employ, but again, I don't think we compare neatly to other groups in the United States of America. I don't think there's any other group that obviously has gone through, as you mentioned, slavery, Jim Crow, and other abuses that have constantly been heaped upon us as a people, not only domestically but internationally and around the world.
But isn't
Right.
that why we should try something different?
I think we do try different things. I think, unfortunately, again, what we don't measure in sometimes when we say, should we try different things? When we look at the different things that we've tried, those things have also been attacked. I think people talk about Black Wall Street. They talk about organizations like the Black Panthers. They talk about UNIA. They talk about the Black Liberation Army. Those are all the civil rights movement. Those are all different strands of Black people attempting to try to get free. No one lets you get free, right? The power, those who have more powerful have done what they can to stop us. Those who are scared of us have done what they can to stop us. Doesn't mean we don't stop fighting and continue to be resilient. But it does mean that we can't suggest that we as a people have not tried different tactics and strategies to get free. We need to continue to try those and see what mix works.
Yes. So I agree that we have tried different tactics and have experienced different success. You know, success to different degrees. I guess what we're speaking primarily to is that the Black community in large and mainly backs movements that are peaceful protests and things of that nature, and have kind of turned their backs on consciously or unconsciously outside influence or inside influence on solutions and methods or tactics that are really standard in terms of people dynamics, power dynamics in the world and history. We have turned our backs on those because they require more work and they seem a lot harder. And going out in the streets and making noise is just a little bit more easier than organizing and building
I'm
institutions.
not going to agree with you totally on that. I don't think Black folks have turned their backs on that strategy. I think actually the folks who say that they want to fight for economic empowerment usually are the ones who will easily turn their backs on a larger community because they see economic empowerment as being something that they can get more so from larger corporations than what they can get from the Black community. So I don't think there's a lot of large Black corporations that have started thinking about what can I do for my people. What they
Right.
start thinking about is how can I make more money and where's that money at? And if that money is facing outward, they'd rather use an outward strategy and they'd placate to the larger community as opposed to sort of putting some of those resources back into our community. And that goes for, everything from what few larger corporations we have. People like to talk about artists and entertainers a lot, but you don't see a lot of community developments by those artists and entertainers in our community.
Right.
They don't do that kind of stuff because they don't want to do anything that they think is going to offend usually those who are, they think, paying their bills in a larger way. So I think it's a twofold thing. I think we can say the community has to do more, but if we think that people who have moneyed interest or resources are going to do more, then we have to hold those folks accountable also.
I agree with that.
Okay, and so we are
Oh, okay.
closing on an agreement. Thank you.
You should
Jennifer.
host more often because we wouldn't do that with Jelani here.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us for Power Talk.
You were great. You're great.
Don't just say that.
No, you're right. No. You
It was good.
Okay.
Yeah, it was good.
It was decent.
The only problem was I don't think you were